Hey guys, this is Christian, and if you're following my channel for quite some time, you probably know that I used to be a big fan of Windows. I mean, I've made several tutorials about customizing my Windows terminal, about Microsoft's open source projects, or about WSL2. So you can say Windows has been my daily driver for many years, and overall I was always very satisfied with it. Until now. Because I need to confess, since I bought my very first Apple computer, the MacBook Air M2, that has changed. I absolutely fell in love with macOS, so much that I even retired my old PC and bought another Apple computer, the Mac Mini M2 Pro. And currently I'm solely working on macOS and I won't go back to Windows or Linux, at least not anytime soon. I know whenever I make a video about operating systems or comparing Windows, Linux and macOS, it's gonna be controversial for some people. But I'm not here to say that macOS is the best operating system or everything else is crap. Instead, I try to do a fair comparison from my point of view and showing you some insights into the tools and workflows I'm using as a tech guy. And if you're in a similar field or just interested in why I've made the full switch to macOS, I hope it's going to be useful to you. So let's do this and talk about some of the pros and cons of Windows and macOS. This video is supported by Teleport, a free and open source access proxy that helps you to securely authenticate to all your IT infrastructure like Linux servers, databases, Kubernetes clusters, web applications or remote desktop. You can easily protect your accounts with modern security features such as two-factor authentication or a passwordless login and access your services through the browser or the CLI tool with audit logging and session recording. And the best, it's completely free in the community version, so you can just download and run it in your entire home lab, or if you'd like to use it in your company, Teleport offers many professional features like auditing, single sign-on and more. It's a great tool, so just check it out. You will find a link to their website in the description of this video. But before we start looking further into the operating system itself and some of the reasons why I've made the full switch to macOS, we first should clarify one of the biggest differences between macOS and Windows, which is kinda obvious, but it is relevant when you want to compare them. And that is macOS only runs on Apple computers, while Windows can be installed on most PCs and laptops commonly available in the market. And you can choose from a wide range of hardware configurations, including Intel or AMD CPUs, as well as various graphics cards, memories and storage options. If you want to get an Apple computer instead, well, you're always just limited to the models and configurations that Apple offers, and you can't really upgrade them afterward. I know some people will now say, well, there's also a Hackintosh around that would allow macOS to run on some non-Apple computers, but I don't consider and I never have considered this a viable option. So to make it simple for everybody, if you want to use macOS without any restrictions or without any issues, the only way is to just buy an Apple computer. And in the past, that was always a no-go for me. Not only because I loved building my own PC and selecting all of the components myself, it also was a lot cheaper. Let's say it bluntly, before 2021, Apple computers were highly overpriced, and buying one would sometimes mean paying twice the money as for a similar Windows PC. But that all changed since Apple released their first computers with their own designed custom processor, the M1, in November 2021. The M1 chip, which is based on an ARM architecture and not the x86 architecture like Intel or AMD CPUs, introduced some significant improvements to Macs, including faster performance, longer battery life, and that allowed Apple to create powerful and more energy-efficient devices, which sometimes even offer a better price value than similar Windows PCs. This completely changed the game, because suddenly Apple computers weren't just for die-hard Apple fans and rich hipsters anymore, at least the ones in the base configuration, but well, that's another topic. But that was mainly the reason why I have decided to buy my very first Apple computer. It's not because I hated Windows or I wanted to move away from it. I actually just wanted to have a new laptop that is light and powerful enough to do 4K video editing. That's why I bought this one here, the new MacBook Air. And because I started to like macOS so much once I got used to it, I also wanted to have the same experience on the desktop as well, and just bought the Mac Mini. Just to say a few words about these devices, both the MacBook Air and the Mac Mini are just wonderful and offer incredible performance. As I said, I'm editing all my 4K YouTube videos on these two small devices without having any issues. Now, I'm not going into too much detail on the devices itself because I'm not really a hardware reviewer and I actually don't want to be. But I can just tell you from my own experience that I'm very excited about the performance and also the build quality of these computers. So long story short, that was how I got into the Apple world. And now, since I've used my Macs for a couple of months in my day-to-day work, I found out I also like the operating system even a bit more than Windows. But let's go through some of these reasons one by one. First, I just embrace the look and feel of macOS. It's just a very user-friendly and intuitive system with a beautiful interface. If you ever used a Mac before, you probably know what I'm talking about. And I would say Windows in comparison is a bit more chaotic. It also has some nice design elements, but overall the user interface is less polished. Don't get me wrong, I don't want to say that Windows today looks terrible. However, it just feels that Apple follows a more consistent design philosophy than Windows. What do I mean by that? So when you just take a look back at the Windows history, you can tell nearly every version of Windows introduced a new design, with some versions even making drastic changes that were later reverted after a few years, like in Windows 8 for instance. But at the same time, there are so many areas in the operating system, even today, that still look like in the early 2000s. Sure, that's not what Microsoft is telling you in their presentations, but once you start taking a look at some older menus or old system settings, you can see that there haven't been made any changes for a pretty long time. And that is not really the case under macOS, at least what I can tell. There are still things that you might like or not like about the design. However, to me it seems that Apple always had a much more clear vision about what the OS should look like and what are the design principles, and that is something I really like about it. On the other hand, you have to say that you can't customize the look and feel of macOS a lot. If you like it, it's great. If you don't, well, you don't have many options to change it. But that's something everybody, I guess, needs to decide for themselves, and to me, the interface of macOS is just one thing that I generally like a bit more than in Windows, but that's of course not the only reason. When you start working with macOS, this is where it gets really interesting, because macOS and Windows are very different in the way how you interact with them, and I would say that both have their pros and cons. It's not that I like everything under macOS. For example, I still like the window management under Windows more, especially with Windows 11 there were some really nice changes, like you could arrange the windows of different applications much faster. That's something that I still miss under macOS. I could fix that by installing a program that is called Moom, and that helps me to resize and reorganize windows with keyboard shortcuts, but it's a bit unfortunate that macOS doesn't have that built in. And there are also some other stupid things that are annoying, like the display management under macOS. That is just weird. However, all the problems that I can complain about are usually minor issues and can be addressed by installing another tool, or if I can't fix them, they are not making my experience on macOS terribly worse. I think it should be clear that nothing in this world is flawless, and whoever is praising macOS as the perfect operating system, well, it's far away from truth. But on the other hand, there are so many other things that are just better on macOS for me than they are under Windows, and they are making my life as a tech guy so much easier. For instance, as an IT guy, you know that I'm often working with terminal programs, not just in the video tutorials here on this YouTube channel, but also in my day-to-day work. I do things like programming and automation with Python and shell scripts, or I'm using DevOps tools like Terraform, Ansible or kubectl. I also like to manage my system settings and configs in .dot files with a Git client, something like Yadam. And for everything that you want to do in a terminal, macOS is just so much better, especially when you're already working with a Linux operating system somewhere else, maybe in your own home lab or at work, because the underlying OS is quite different than Windows. While Windows uses the Windows NT kernel that has its roots in MS-DOS, macOS runs a highly customized kernel based on Unix and BSD. So it has a combination of Unix components along with Apple's proprietary technologies, and it's actually more similar to Linux as it is to Windows. That's why there are so many powerful tools integrated into macOS that you might know from Linux, like the ZSH shell or all the commands to list files, navigate through the terminal, grep, awk, and sed. There's also a package manager for macOS existing that is called Homebrew, and that works just like apt or pacman under Linux. You can even automate a lot of stuff on your Mac, like installing programs or managing .dot files, configs, and system settings by using scripts and commands, just as you would typically do it under Linux. It all feels like you are working on a Linux system, but with a better desktop and app support. Now you can say that Windows also offers similar features with the introduction of WSL2 and some other nice projects like Cygwin, the Windows Terminal. I need to say I still love that under Windows, that's why I've made several video tutorials about that in the past, but this is still not a native Windows feature, because WSL2, for example, is actually just a small and highly customized virtual Linux system running inside Windows, and there are some problems that are based on that additional layer, such as this virtual machine has its own networking stack with a separate IP address, or when you want to install a program on Windows, you can't do that in WSL2, you always need to switch back to PowerShell. That is all not necessary under macOS. You can just open a terminal and natively access all your favorite terminal-based tools without having this extra layer of virtualization. That isn't just much faster, it also does away with some of the problems you might have with WSL2. So to summarize it, macOS is just better for me than Windows when I'm doing productivity work. It offers better features for programming, working in a terminal, and is very similar to Linux. That alone was enough to get me excited about macOS, but I also found out it even gets more and more useful when you combine it with other Apple products. You can like or dislike this strategy, but if you buy an iPhone and an Apple Watch, maybe an iPad, you get access to some really cool things you can do with your Mac, because Apple products work together seamlessly. Like you can answer a call on your iPhone or on your Mac, and when you need to walk away from your desk, you can just continue the same call on your phone without any interruptions. You can unlock your Mac with your Apple Watch. You don't need to type in a password to access your Mac, you can just press a button on your watch. It's just amazing. Or when you need to scan a document, you can click on import from iPhone or iPad and then use this device as a scanner. You can also share other files quickly and easily across your devices with AirDrop. Even things like copy and paste are available across these devices. For example, if you have written a longer text or you have a URL on your Mac that you just want to have on your phone, you can copy it on your Mac, and on your iPhone you simply paste it. You don't need to enable anything for these features or set up an application, it just magically works. These are the smaller things that you probably don't notice right from the beginning. I didn't know a lot of this stuff myself, but the more I've used my Mac together with other Apple devices, I just discovered some of these unique capabilities, and I often had this moment where I thought, wow, this is so easy and amazing. That is what makes my life easier, and it gives me some useful features that I didn't know from Windows. Now, of course, this would mean absolutely nothing when my favorite programs wouldn't work on macOS, and I quickly need to address this because I had a few concerns about that, because just like I said, Apple today offers only ARM-based systems with the M1 and M2 chips, and they probably won't go back to Intel anymore. Windows also did a few experiments in that area with Windows RT, now it is called Windows on ARM. And we all know how that works. The main problem is that all the programs that were developed for an x86 architecture, they won't run natively on an ARM-based chip, so every developer needs to change their applications to support ARM-based CPUs, or they have to emulate them somehow. And Apple did something really cool to do that. They developed Rosetta. Rosetta is an emulator that translates the x86 instructions on the fly into ARM instructions in real time, and it works works surprisingly well. So all the applications that were developed for x86 you can still run on macOS. Most people wouldn't even notice that. You just need to be aware this is still a translation, so programs that are not really made for ARM-based chips, they will run slower. But actually the support is pretty good. As you can see, there aren't many programs that run with the Rosetta translation layer on my Mac, so I never ran into any problems with that. As I said, most of the apps are available for Apple Silicon now, and the few ones that need to run with the Apple Rosetta engine, they just work great as they would work under Windows. Of course, when you think about games, this is something that a Mac isn't made for. I guess you can play a few games on a Mac, but to be honest, I actually haven't tried playing any games on my Mac, and I think you shouldn't buy a Mac for gaming. That is just what I can tell you. And overall, we have to accept that Windows still has the best compatibility out there. There's nothing you can do against that. However, I rarely see devices or programs that don't work on macOS but work under Windows. There will be always a few niche applications or devices where support is missing, but all the devices that I have are working great on Mac. All the Elgato stuff that I'm using for live streaming or video recording, they all work totally fine because Elgato offers drivers and applications for macOS and Apple Silicon as well. But this might be a thing you need to keep in mind. If you buy an Apple computer, you get good compatibility with various hardware components and applications, but it's still lacking a bit behind Windows. Anyway, that is what I have to say about macOS and Windows and why I've made the switch. Before I stop the video, I just want to say, if you don't agree with some of these points or you just don't like macOS, that's totally fine. But it would be interesting for me to know how many of you are already working on a Mac, or how many of you are consider buying an Apple computer, because I think we could make some really nice content around this from time to time, like explaining all the terminal programs, the tools and workflows I'm using on my Mac. Please tell me in the comments what you would like to see in the future, and as always, thanks everybody for watching. I will catch you in the next video. Take care. Bye bye.